ضخم تبدو آثاره الانفجار الثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're here with Roxy Hall, author of 10 Theses on the Gender Question, which I believe was published at Cosmonaut Magazine. And we'll be discussing the implications of a materialist view of gender, how that differs from either, let's say, trans-friendly liberal feminism, radical, trans-exclusionary radical feminism, and maybe even other prior Marxist conceptions of gender relations. So how are you doing today, Roxy? You're coming in from down under, so it's a completely different time of day for you. You're basically 12 hours in the future.
Yeah, well, the future looks bleak, so you know. So at least from where I am.
The present looks bleak too. So,
well, you know, yeah, it certainly seems that way. But yeah, no, I'm well.
All right.
This is my first time ever on like a video thing, so like I'm a little bit nervous, but I think this will be good.
Yeah, I understand. These things are always more harrowing at first time than you think. I hated when I first streamed. So, I found your 10 thesis pretty interesting. I wanted to single in on your point 2, which I'm going to read for my audience and give you a chance to really expand on what you mean here. The question of gender is ultimately that of division of labor, but, and this is a big but, it cannot be reduced to the same thing as a class identity, which is also your point 4. So, what do you mean by that? The question of gender is a function of division of labor, but it is separate and unique from class.
Yeah, well, I think that like ultimately when we're looking at, it's quite easy to reduce sort of different, I guess, social categories into one another, so you can, you know, kind of draw an easy comparison between gender and class, or gender and race is another one which is quite common. I think the problem here is that ultimately these things are constructed very differently. And we can sort of begin with how they appear, or at least begin with the sort of immediate experience of these things, which is that like the way in which we experience gender and the way in which we experience class are very different. So like gender by its nature has an identitarian component. I kind of resist reducing gender purely to identity in the piece, but it's quite clear that like people identify with their gender, their assigned gender, or the gender that they are living as, in the sense that they at the very least know what gender they're meant to be. So, you know, the vast majority of people know that they are men or women, or at least know that they are meant to be men and women. Whereas by its nature, class, people do not necessarily know what class they're a member of. They can be ensconced within all sorts of ideological structures. So like if we take, for example, like a proletarian may not recognize the condition of their life. They may consider themselves like a whole variety of, you know, possible ways they could understand themselves ideologically, but they remain a proletarian. Whereas a woman or a man, by the sort of nature of that category, are aware of both themselves and the role of their social other. Men and women are aware of their kind of like the role that men and women are meant to play in society. So I think that on the immediate level, there seems to be some differences. But I think those belie a deeper distinction between gender and class. Ultimately, I think that gender relations or gender sex, I mean, I don't draw a hard distinction between those two categories, are ultimately, they reflect a certain sort of set of labor relations or a certain division of labor, but it is ultimately a cultural superstructural form that regulates those. So you're looking at a whole set of social and cultural markers that are directly linked to this gender category, such as modes of dress, colors, modes of speech, that aren't directly linked to the role that, say, the female sex or female gender plays in the labor, in the social division of labor. Like the color pink has very little to do with like domestic work, but it is intimately sort of associated in the Western context with femaleness. And I don't think that's the same as being proletarian. There seems to be a distinction here that's not immediately clear, but it's certainly worth unpacking.
Well, while there are multiple gender identities, even within the concept of, say, woman, which I think that could be unpacked what I just said. Like there are multiple identities in the concept of women, and there are multiple identities in the concept of proletariat. There does seem to be more of an immediate, cultural epiphenomenal role of femaleness or womanness than there is of proletarianness, and also the single definer of like gender sex or gender or sex relations or whatever. And I'm also using the complicated terms that you are here because I think we have to. Also seems to be bogged down to me in like these divisions of labor that are often extension. And I'm going to say this, extrapolating from your work and get your ideas about it. Extensions of social reproduction sort of limitations. So these visions of labor are often labor that are seen as socially necessary, but not like female work has often not been linked to, say, commodity production or rent seeking. It's often linked to services and care work. And this, it's exact, like we might say this is like totally culturally relative, but in the capitalist world, that doesn't seem to be true. Like that there are consistencies between very different capitalist societies, or very different even what you might call quasi or non-capitalist societies like China, where you still see similar divisions of social labor, even though like the traditional family forms and whatnot that those were associated with, it may have been even instrumentally rational for, no longer exist, right? So why do you think that is? I know for people who aren't as used to social reproduction theory, this is probably a lot of verbiage they're not like familiar with, but why do you think that is? What is going on in the division between man and women beyond just, say, reproductive differences?
Yeah, well, I think that like we can draw this down to a fundamental division in the types of work that are expected of people and the various social, I guess, ideological structures that are meant to organize that work. So this is like kind of at the core of the social reproduction theory argument, right? Is that there's like a sort of world of reproductive labor that's necessary to reproduce social life, and that's seen as largely outside of what we might call the economy, I guess, or what is understood to be the economy. And I think that like there are a bunch of historical and anthropological debates as to the origins of this division. I think personally, the division between public and private spheres is a huge part of this. That like there is with the emergence of with generally there's a general trend with the emergence of settled societies, or as societies become more settled, that there's a tendency for a distinction between the public and the private world to develop. And certain forms of labor that occur within the private world are essentially seen as, but we're naturalized, right? So like, it is natural for women to be carers. It is natural for women to raise children. It is natural for women to be domestic workers, because it occurs within the domestic sphere, which is private, which is hidden, and then you have the public-facing world. I mean, I think this is like a really, you can even see it in contemporary capitalist societies. To pull like a very pop cultural example here, you've got like, for example, men in a country like the United States. My hair is a mess. In the country like in the United States, it is like cooking is broadly speaking, or in traditional, let's say like a 1950s housewife situation, because obviously things have changed a lot since the 80s, and that's probably worth going into. But like say a traditional like housewife situation, women cook if it's inside the home, but if it's outside the home, literally in like the garden in the form of like grilling on a barbecue or something, that's men's work. It's overwhelmingly men who like grill publicly. Like cooking publicly is seen as a man's job, but cooking privately is overwhelmingly done by women. And if you look at like celebrity chefs and like people who cook professionally, the gender division switches back towards men.
Right.
Even when the work itself is overwhelmingly done by women. I think that's really worth noting, right? Because the you have this like situation in which if something is done in the home with socially necessary labor that is necessary for the daily reproduction and survival of the human race and of capitalist society, it is seen as not work, but just a normal part of human life. And it's seen as, it's naturalized. Silvia Federici in Evolution at Point Zero, I think it's in Wages Against Housework, or maybe Sexuality as Work, I can't remember the exact essay, points out that like it is seen as to be part of our feminine nature. Women are caring, women are kind, they are good at looking after children. They want to, it's part of their feminine nature. And they want to, and so that is this ideological, I guess, superstructural element of this division of labor that's happening in society's base.
Okay, so I find that these generalizations are true even in areas where we don't notice them. For example, I have talked about public versus private facing left work, work for left causes or whatever. The media sphere is overwhelmingly either male. We can get into transidentification here later because it does play in, but then or female people taking male-ish characteristics is almost ubiquitous, particularly among cis women on left media. But when you go do left activism, the gender roles are almost reversed, as if the activist role is seen as part of the private sphere, right? Another interesting one is work that is devalued because not just because it is care work, but because it is seen as care work because women are more likely to do it, and it also makes men who do it suspect. And I'll give you an interesting example. In the English-speaking world, when you think of a male teacher, what grade levels are they working with? Or I mean, in Australia, what age levels are they working with generally?
A male teacher, overwhelmingly high school.
Overwhelmingly high school, secondary school at least, right? Right.
Yeah, I mean, an example of this, right, is my partner is a man, and he works at a childcare center, but is like one of the only men in a center that has like easily 20 plus employees. I think he has like maybe 2 men there, and I mean, one of them is like the gardener. So like, I think he may be the only male carer, or he was when he first got employed there.
And frankly, particularly interestingly, heterosexual men involved in working with younger children. That for a lot of people, and I've talked to cis women about this, talked to a bunch of normies, throws off a vibe of either predator or you're not what you say you are, like almost immediately. And the interesting thing about that, to me, is that it comports with what you're describing. Like, people are going, well, you're violating some unspoken, like not just cultural norm, but unspoken work differentiation, and in doing so, you are making yourself suspect. And that goes, of course, we see that with women, whether they're assigned women at birth or not. But we also we see that in the reactions even to certain kinds of heterosexual men, and I'm being very specific on my categories here, doing certain kinds of labor. It was just assumed that if you are doing that, there must be something defective about you, because one, it's devalued work anyway, and two, why on earth would a male want to be a caregiver to young children? They must have ulterior motives.
Yeah, no, totally. I think another example of this. Oh, sorry, no, you go. You finish.
No, go ahead. No, I'm not going to overspeak you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, on the activism division of labor stuff, this is definitely something that I've seen in my experience. Like, and even within activist spaces, you'll often see men being more willing to take on roles, or maybe not even more willing, but more readily able to speak up in order to speak on, especially media spokesperson like roles, and like often like theoretical roles. And you get a lot of like pigeonholing here as well, right? Where like if you're a woman or if you're a queer person, I think this also happens to people of color as well, though I can't really comment. Where like if you're a woman, then you're expected to want to speak on women's issues. And like if there's like a discussion, like, if you're running discussion nights or reading groups or whatever, it's like, oh, well, you're a woman, so you want to lead the social reproduction theory discussion. And it's like, well, that's true. I do. But I also want to talk about, like, I don't know, imperialism and political economy and stuff that, isn't immediately like in the rubric of women's issues, which are the issues that you're meant to talk about and care about. Whereas men, this I guess is Simone de Beauvoir's point, right? Men are universal. Men are not specific. They don't have a specificity. They are universal subjects. They can and do discuss anything, talk about anything, because they can speak for humanity and women cannot. On the point about like being suspect, I think this is true. I think it's like, at the very least, there's a sense of like defectiveness. For example, like if a man says, oh, the man who's like getting good grades at school and is going into the medical field says, I'm going to be a nurse. There's kind of like there's a sense of like, oh, why are you not going to try to become a doctor? Or at the very least, a paramedic, which I guess is where the gender division swings back. Because it's a more action-oriented role, I guess. Or at least it's seen that way socially. But if a woman who's getting the same grade says, I want to be a nurse, then most people will be like, oh, good for you. That's a very respectable profession. I think that's very true. I mean, if you look at teachers in schools, overwhelmingly, women are dominant. And then if you look at school principals, like in my state, overwhelmingly men dominant.
Yeah, so it's overwhelmingly men.
Yeah. I think that the further up you get up, management hierarchies, bureaucratic hierarchies, you see more and more men. And this is not an argument for like sort of corporate feminist, like women in high places argument, but it shows the social division of labor here, where men are seen as active protagonists in the social world, where women are simply maintaining. I think that like you can also see this to a degree in academia. I think that like I'm very fortunate to attend a philosophy department that has like a lot of very strong women, but like men are still overrepresented in philosophy, like heavily overrepresented. Actually, it's one of the humanities disciplines that doesn't have like a they tend to lean more towards women these days, but philosophy probably is one of the ones where it doesn't. And I
Philosophy
think that you
and
can definitely still see
history,
that kind of
are the two, objectively
philosophy and
speaking, are the
history.
two. Yeah. Like, I mean, just
Whereas if
as
you go into
an
like
English teacher. Yeah. Go ahead.
if you go into an anthropology or sociology lecture, it's going to be overwhelmingly women. I just think that's interesting. I don't really know what it says, but I think it's interesting. I do think that also uh, Michel Ledouf, the French feminist, also notes that like when women do write academia, they are often, this is especially true in the French tradition, women are often sort of compartmentalized as like historians of ideas, that women can be trusted to like look after the ideas of men who came previously, and treat them with the reverence that they deserve. Women are still sort of sorted into followers, whereas men are leaders. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways in which these dynamics play out in the social level, and I think that to a degree, a part of this, partly it's related directly to the social division of labor within social reproduction, but also I think it testifies to the relative autonomy of the superstructure. That these sort of social structures, once they're constructed through like historical processes, they are extant, and they unfold and play out in a variety of interesting ways that might not be directly linked to the sort of social material world, I guess.
I think this kind of leads me to some of the parts of your theses that may not be like most of what we're talking about right now is stuff that you would even hear on the standard liberal feminist, or maybe even not even liberal feminist, like just standard sociological discussions of this as to why would be where the interpretive gloss goes. But one thing I think is interesting about this is, for example, the default being men. We could also say the default is whatever dominant thing is in sociology, like default being white, default being whatever. Ironically, I am one of those people who thinks that, for example, white identity politics as a separate politics that is explicitly white identity politics is an indication of declining relative power, which is something that may be controversial. Does not mean that they aren't still the dominant power, for example, but it is like, if you look at it, it's also directly related to a feeling of not being in demographics not going your way, et cetera, and so forth. But it seems somewhat interestingly distinct with gender when we get into other areas. So on this identification thing, or in this like what work is valued versus what work isn't being gendered, in the defaults of functions and all this is pretty standard for, we could talk about this in all identity categories. I mean, even some, like if we get really specific, certain identities of certain kinds of white male workers would be more likely to speak up in certain contexts and similar patterns if we did very, very minute sociology on it. What I think is interesting about gender, and what you hit it on in the beginning, though, is it this ripples in other areas of people's lives in ways that everyone is aware of. And like you said, for example, the proletarian capitalist distinction can be obscured, but the gender distinction really can't be. But I think this also can make us view gender in too simplistic terms, right? Like I mean, there's been studies, for example, and this is not to get, I'm not getting into the health of this or not, but the studies about the perceived feminization of severely overweight men, right? I'm actually going to use like terms that I wouldn't use personally, but are probably more politically acceptable these days, of fat men. Well, that's not an immediately gendered construct. I mean, in a way that, like, why would overweight men be seen? Yes, there's like biological proportional differences between averages between men and women of fat reserves and this, that, and the other, but like fat male trending bodies do not look like fat female trending bodies. So what is the gendered difference going on there? And it's something that's small and distinct, and yet is very, like, people talk about it over and over. It comes up in the literature on gender a lot, actually. So this brings me to the fact that like it's almost impossible to find a single origin to talk about gender, or from like even though we talk about this distinction that's clearly obvious, we talk about the social reproduction distinctions that's clearly obvious, but the category seems way more complicated than, say, race, where where most, but like whatever the difference between Marxist and CRT people are, for example, and there's tons, we all kind of agree that race was a construct that, if you study, like, say, even like hard sciences, you go, oh well, there's no correlation between skin color, race, and like phenotype, or even really morphology. Like, whereas with gender, there's a bunch of correlations. Some of them are biological, but no single one is definitional, so no single one can really explain everything. And I think this actually, ties into like what you talk about, biological sex being actually a manifestation of gender ideology, because there's multiple factors going on there. Would you like to go into that? Am I interpreting you correctly, even?
Yeah, I think there's a whole pile of stuff to get into here. So let's just like jump into it. I think that, like, hey, first thing first, I think that, like, the category of man, right? Let's start by theorizing the category of man. Because I think the category of man is very interesting. And there's a lot of ideological work, right? The category of man is a privileged category. It's far more privileged than the category of woman in a certain way. And there are, I would essentially say that essentially what we have within our social gender construct is we have two spoken, a kind of bimodal spoken framework of gender. So we have two, like, spoken or socially recognized genders. And then you have a third unspoken gender. This is like kind of my kind of like pocket theorization here. And the third unspoken gender is essentially a non-man, non-woman discard category. So the way that I often term it is that even though I was not assigned, so I'm obviously a trans woman, even though I was not assigned woman at birth, I would say that even though I was like assigned male, I was not raised as a man on the basis that at a young age I was thrown into the social category of faggot, basically. The social category of defective, non-man, sort of discard pile of social life. And it's essentially a third gender. Like, it has a social function as basically being a regulatory structure for like the other gender categories. And so you have like a hierarchical relation between man and woman, and then you have a kind of like the gendered versus the genderless essentially being thrown out of the social category, which is different to being like genderless by like because of non-binary identity. I think that's worth noting. But like we I think that like like I think the category of like the sort of like perceived feminization of certain groups of men, either because they are fat, or because they are like homosexual, or because there's a whole variety of reasons why one might be discarded from the category of man. And also women who are discarded from the category of women. So like, for example, if you're, say, a butch lesbian, you are not like you are often denied, your womanhood is often denied. People say you're not a real woman, people mistreat you on that basis, but you're not treated as a man. Like butch lesbians are not given the social standing that men are given.
Ask a trans man who was a former butch lesbian how their experience is, and they will tell you a lot about that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, totally. Right? And so you are existing within this kind of like complex. So I think there is this third gender category. It's an unspoken one, but it is essentially the gender category that I would say is denoted by the word faggot. Like it is, that is what's being gestured towards in the slur, right? Is right. Like there is this group of people who are essentially not fit to be part of our gender categories. But right. It is necessary the slur to have itself, people as a disciplinary regulation.
Well, the slur itself literally refers to people that you would throw on a pyre. Like they are like, yeah. I don't mean to like go like, I tried to explain to someone like what that term means. I'm like, the reason why it's the same word as you use for a cigarette in England, because it means to turn to ash or to small stick to which you burn. And, you know, and these are people that you would burn as heretics in the early modern period. And interesting, probably not before that wouldn't have come up. And I say that also because like it's very hard to discuss categories of sexuality before liberal modernity goes in, because they simply, the ancient world does not have them the way we do. And
yes, that's something that I kind of gesture at in my piece, but I don't go into a lot of detail on.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to talk about you though is talk to you about this is I think I have trouble saying the F word because it doesn't feel like I should say it. But from the category of faggot to the category of like loser man are on a spectrum on this third gender category. Like, and I also think about it when we think about like the historical early modern concept of eunuch and stuff like that. Like,
I talk about eunuchs in my piece,
right?
In Imperial China, because I think that like this is like my argument for. Okay, I'm going to circle around a little bit here because I think there's a few things we need to touch on before we get to this kind of argument, right? So on the difference between race and gender, I think this is quite important. Broadly speaking, one inherits their race from their parents. In some sense, right? You inherit your race. It's something that you're born into. That is not true of gender. Two men can raise a woman child, right? This is we can see this, and thanks to IVF, two women can have a child biologically. So there's no like, obviously there's nuances here, but broadly speaking, one inherits their race from their parents. One does not inherit their gender from their parents. Also, by the same token, I think that gender, like the race essentially as like a world system, or like if we look at it in relation to empire, right? The way that it plays out globally, one doesn't need to be aware of the racial category that they have been assigned in order for them to experience racial domination, right? So broadly speaking, all adults know what gender category they're meant to be, even if they then rebel against that in some way or another. They know what I know that I'm meant to be a man, right? Or whatever social category. Even if I live as a woman, like I know what I'm meant to be in the sense of like what society has indicated for me. Whereas like if you're living in, say, if you're like, so take an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon, their land may be slated to be destroyed, and that be ideologically justified that they are savages and barbarians. That is a function of race. That can happen to them without them having any knowledge of the racial world system. Like,
Right.
they don't need to know about racial dynamics and like the fact that they are brown. They see themselves as whatever indigenous tribe they're a member of. But they've been slated because they are indigenous. They've been slated for this like genocidal project because of a racial world system that they may not be necessarily immediately aware of. And that exposes some differences between the two forms. I think that also we can see that in the question of like biology, right? So race has no basis in biology. We can see this, right? And this is like basically accepted in the social sciences,
Right.
and in the natural sciences.
It's more or less accepted
by
in
everybody
anthropology
except
too. Right.
Oh yeah, totally. Oh yeah, I did anthropology courses at university. My best friend is an anthropologist. There is no like only fringe cranks believe that race has a biological component, and also like a huge amount of ordinary people.
Let's say it's like one of the things where like the sciences will say like, okay, the biggest thing that I would say to people is like the genetic differences between two groups of quote sub-Saharan. It's a problematized category, but I'm just gonna have to use it because that's what we got. Sub-Saharan Africans is larger than between say a Kalahari Bushman, a Chinese person, and a Brit, right? Like. And people are like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, because the phenotypical difference is more extreme, which tells you that the morphological differences that we're attaching to race don't say anything about the genes underneath at all, which is not obvious. That is not obvious to someone who does not understand, phenotype, gene expression, and morphology, which, to be frank, most people don't understand when it comes to people.
And for someone who's grown up in an imperial world system where these differences are given great weight, I think that like on the question of like sex, right? I think that there is some like much more room for discussion. There is obviously human beings obviously have a sort of bimodal sex distribution, where you have kind of like groupings of a certain sexual dimorphism, with a kind of bimodal sort of distribution along that. There are lots of people who fall kind of in between there, and there's arguments like, I mean, I know there's some articles where people have argued that like human beings display like several sexes in like statistically important categories. Like there's like statistically important numbers. Like there's a bunch of different arguments here. But roughly, let's say that human beings are bimodal. But the importance that is given to biological differences is a social phenomena. I think this is the key, right? I'm trying to think of like my earlobes are unattached. You can't see them because I'm wearing the Cartier headphones. But like my earlobes are unattached, and other people have attached earlobes. We do not ascribe social importance to that, right? It's a biological category. It's just as much a marker of genetic difference as like whether or not somebody has like certain secondary sex characteristics. But because of human history, because of the contingencies of human life, we have ascribed certain power to one and not the other. And that tells us that the social is dominant here, not the biological. Because the reality is that like, and you could say, you can make the argument that like, oh, well, but your sex characteristics make a lot more difference to your life than your earlobes being unattached. But like, let's take something else. Like, I don't know, like there's a whole bunch of biological differences between us that like make, like some people are more prone to heart disease or lung cancer. We don't build our social structures around that difference. There isn't like social provisions on like who can use what bathroom because of like who has the breast cancer gene or the heart disease gene. And it's like those differences are quite important to people's lives. And so are your sex characteristics. Like they determine all sorts of health outcomes and all sorts of things. And it's important for your doctor to be able to like, you and your doctor or whatever to talk about these things. But the fact that certain things have bearing on our social reality and so others don't is important. It's also worth noting that a bunch of the things that we ascribe to gender aren't important to our lives at all. You'll see, or to sex, you'll see, especially if you get into the transphobic feminists and their right-wing allies, they'll talk endlessly about weird things like your Q angle, or the way in which your hips sit and the way you walk. It's this is not medically important. So, but it's being ascribed to social power here. It's being ascribed an immense social power, and social power which could determine if someone's life is good or not. And that tells us that the social is dominating over the biological here. But this is fundamentally a social problem, which is my critique of those feminists who want to ascribe the problems of patriarchy to testosterone, or to something about men, male physiology makes them prone to oppressive violence. I don't see that. I don't think it bears out. I also think that so getting back to the thing about eunuchs, this is where we can be well, if human sex is broadly speaking bimodal, that would imply, if you believe that gender maps onto this, that would imply that every single gender system in human history would be binary.
Mm.
But they're not. They're not.
No,
Human societies have regularly constructed third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh gender categories. And almost always that is to do with the social division of labor. So in my article, I use the example of the eunuch in Imperial China, but you could use other examples as well. The eunuch is a social category of a type of person who performs a certain form of labor. And because of the cultural needs, or this is almost a functionalist kind of argument here, because of essentially the sort of development of these social structures, this third gender category emerges, where these people are essentially treated as this separate gender who perform these tasks. And we need them to be a separate gender because something about the other genders makes them unable to perform these tasks. So in China, it was the role of the imperial bureaucrat. And the reason why, if the eunuch was the imperial bureaucrat was because they were familyless, they were impartial, they were deprived of the vigor of masculinity, which would cause them to act irrationally. And notably, not only were they assigned a new gender category, but their biological sex was intervened in. Physical changes were made in order to make sure that this happened, which tells us that sex is being actively modified by gender. That the social, essentially, is determining the biological. And that, I think, sociologically and as radicals, as Marxists, tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about what's going on here. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. But I hope
that's a great tangent. I was actually thinking about the use of eunuchs and, for example, the janissary system of say the Ottoman courts for the same reasons, because you didn't want people who could inherit certain kinds of positions, and you would modify, you would literally end their reproductive capacity basically to change their gender into this thing so that they would fit into this specific kind of social reproduction function.
Another example of this would be a variety of indigenous American societies where third gender categories are created as members of a kind of shaman social function or priesthood social function, where you have people who are deemed to be sort of closer to a kind of divinity because of their relationship to because they sort of straddle gender binaries. I mean, and you can even argue, I would argue, but monks in medieval Europe also served this function. They removed themselves from their kind of traditional masculine role of social life, they were seen as men socially, but they functionally served a different gender role in a sort of divine category, and there were also women who did this. So I think there's obviously spectrums here, right, and like complexities, but removing a group of people from the normal gender role to get them to play a different one in the social division of labor, and having that be marked by like marked differences, say vows of chastity or castration or other, vows or social rituals, is just part of the organization
Right.
of class society. It's part of the organization of human society. So I think that it tells us a lot.
I was thinking about in the context of of monastics, particularly in non-Christian monastics, actually, because there's no representative function of a male deity. The first thing you do when you take on a monastic role is to remove most of the non-surgically removable things that would identify your gender in whatever society you're in, or identify your sex, if we're going to make that distinction. And I think about so what do you do if you become a Buddhist monk, for example? Or you shave your beard, you cut off your hair, regardless of whether or not you're male or female, so that you are not identifiable immediately. You wear clothes that hide your body, right? Now, there's still gendered relations within this, but the idea is that you are removing yourself from the householder world entirely. You are thus removing yourself from social reproduction and thus serving different folds. Now, there's a lot of very dumb comments being made in the stream right now, and so I am going to give you a chance to talk about this, because someone's like, when you count monks as gender, then literally every social role is gender. No, that's not what we're saying. Most social roles will not remove yourself from householder or commodity building or certain roles in social reproduction. And in many of these cases, you are physical mutilation, castration was common. Christian monks in particular, because it was a very long time before there was formal rules against it, would often castrate themselves so they wouldn't fall back into the role of their prior gender. Now, I know this doesn't comport with people who have a third grade understanding of biology. Our people with social ideologies create physical reality. You're literally modifying physical biological reality to comport to social categories all the time.
Yes, I say this in my article, right?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So, let's take, for example, if you take the examples I give, leaving aside trans people entirely, right? Cis men, cis women, heterosexual men and women modify their bodies to pursue their gender roles constantly. So let's take some examples. There are sort of an idealized feminine and an idealized masculine. They're products of social ideology. And men and women, if they want to be valued in their social role, are expected to adhere to these categories. Men work out and steroid cycle and do all sorts of things to their bodies in order to conform to a certain social reality. Women shave their legs and shave their arms and shave their facial hair. Cis women shave their facial hair all the time and get their eyebrows done and do all these social rituals, literally modifying the body, right? Your leg hair, your arm hair, your facial hair, that's part of your biological body. It's part of your biological sex. But this, so-called sex, but it is modified constantly in order to achieve social goals, in order to adhere to social structures. And that is important. That is very, very important. I think it's important because it tells us that like what trans people do actually isn't that unusual. It's not that unusual at all. It's actually coherent with a broader social kind of a broader kind of understanding of our social world. If we actually look at what's going on beneath the surface and don't just accept surface realities. But for those people who do, do these things, like it's not like a critique. It's just saying that this is like, yeah, it's about achieving this sort of idealized form, and that idealized form is a product of ideology. I mean, I think that's pretty uncontroversial. Maybe it is.
It's very, unfortunately, it's definitely controversial when you talk about it in these terms. It is not uncontroversial when you talk about it in other terms, because what you'll hear is stuff is like, well, don't physical reality shape social ones? And I'm like, one, it's a feedback loop. No one is saying that bodies don't do certain things certain ways, but the importance that we assign to which things we're assigning to what social categories is. And the fact that it's culturally relative in ways, and I think this is actually interesting. What the demarcators that we would consider feminizing are culturally relative beyond a few basic, largely genital and breast related things. It's actually less relative probably than some of the social caregiving roles assumed for women, which I think is an interesting distinction. Right now, how that manifests is different, and also things like, for example, I've heard it argued many times. This is one that I've done a lot of research on. That, for example, the difference between male and female interest in STEM is related, particularly in math, is related to gender differences in the brain. Except that when you look at that interculturally, but looking at, for example, specifically Chinese, Japanese, and Korean cultures, that distinction and ability is not there. And this also kind of messes with the liberal feminist argument. That is not because Japanese, Korean, and Chinese society is not sexist. Like, in fact,
yes,
like if you were to make that argument, that's absurd. There have been some people who have tried to argue, for example, I saw a conservative outlet argue that what this really means is like, actually, the less sexist you are, the less likely women are to enter STEM fields. And I'm like, well, how? No, you're just using a weird sample size because of the influence of East Asian populations on the general public. You can't do that when you're making cultural comparisons. Just go to absolute numbers. But it's interesting because it points out that this thing that we see as essential in our culture is not. Now, the caregiving roles and the roles and related to children and reproductive labor around children is remarkably consistent between China, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc. But these other things are not. And I think, whether or not you say, okay, with this biological, relationships to labor, but, to this distinction, I'm like, sure. You're like, yes, it does. If you're going to have a child, it does help to have a womb. But there's a whole lot of other functions that we have seen plenty of social people deal with. I mean, societies deal with that do not fall into that category. And in fact, there's been whole kinds of societies based on people opting out of that category as to mitigate kinds of nepotism, relations of power, certain kinds of use of social surplus, etc. And these are not just modern phenomena. So this is also some of my arguments with a lot of like Marxist specific use of gender, where you have some people take a vulgar form of social reproduction theory and argue that like our gendered stuff now is purely a modern capitalist phenomenon. And I'm like, on what planet? Like no, this is more complicated than that.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, okay, I want to, on the thing about like material realities determining social ones. I feel that this is a vulgar Marxist thing. Like, let us be clear here, right? Social realities are material realities. Like, yeah, our bodies are material, but so is who does the dishes. These are material. These are real. They are instantiated in a social order. Like social relationships, these sort of senses of power. This is material. This is material reality. It's about the organization of things and stuff and the people who do them. This is just as material as giving birth. And yes, okay, obviously, having a womb is helpful to raise children, to have children. But does having a womb help you do the dishes? And if so, why do women do them far more than men? I think okay, it was a few years ago now, and the last couple of censuses in Australia haven't been all that useful for a variety of reasons, mainly because there were massive statistical fuck-ups. But a few years ago, I believe that the statistical numbers came through, and the majority of housework in Australia, well, around about 60% or maybe above, was done by women. And a significant proportion of men, maybe even just under a quarter of men, did next to no housework at all.
Yeah,
I don't think that whether or not one has a cock determines that. Like, I don't think it does. I think it's clearly quite more complicated than that. Now, this is the thing, right? It's like, okay, the category of woman is very complex. Gender categories are very complex. There is no singular point which you can say this is what the sex gender category is. And I mean, we could get into like the basic social constructivist, sort of things like, we could talk about definitions of chairs for a while. But like the fundamental thing is that what we're talking about here is a cluster property. And this is an idea that comes out of biological science, right? This idea that comes out of how we define like species. Because ultimately that is also a social construct. I know, yes. Speciation is taxonomy is a social construct. Species aren't real. Like,
right.
It's
there's no consistent definition in species, actually. Like whether or not species can breed or not is not consistent between species types, et cetera, and so forth. And this is something that only people who are really informed on biology tend to know. But like that, you're like, no, there's not.
So like. So we take a cluster property, right? So we've got all these so basically we've got a cluster of properties around this category. So let's say woman. And this cluster of properties is like, you need to have enough of them. You don't need to have all of them to be a woman, but you need to have more than none. And the exact number is unclear. And in fact, it's socially variable. And that doesn't mean that the category isn't important or useful or, socially powerful, but it does mean that it's ill-defined. So there's a whole bunch of things. And one of those, is absolutely having female primary sex characteristics and female secondary sex characteristics. But my best friend is a butch lesbian. If we go to the shops and are hanging out together, we are often mistaken, like she is more likely to be mistaken for a man than I am. She's a cis woman. And that, I feel, is socially important. That tells us something socially, which is that there are these cluster categories. And like my challenge to the transphobic feminists or those who think that like social gender sex can be reduced entirely down to biology is to give me a definition of woman that includes all women or all cis women and excludes all trans women, and that is socially is useful in day-to-day life, but you can apply in daily life, but doesn't require you to do chromosomal checks to make sure who goes to the toilet. Do it. Find me one. Find me one that doesn't require some sort of insanely invasive and medically impossible series of tests and tasks. So yeah, I think that like when we talk about material in the Marxist sense, we don't just mean biological. We mean material in the sense that it's to do with the world of matter and things. The organization of social life is material. And I think that that's like important.
I think I mean,
that's
like,
kind of a philosophical point, but it's a useful one.
Well, it's a huge one by what we mean by materialist. For example, when we refer to economics as materialist, we're not referring to something. The social reproduction of life is not without reference to biology, but it is also not determined by pre-existing biological categories. Actually, Marx talks about this explicitly, not in terms of gender, but in terms of species being. And I bring this up all the time, but his thing about like we can't know what dog nature is unless we see dogs without social moderation or without our social moderating influence. We will never see that, because our interaction with dogs will always be predicated by us being there. And ironically, this led to this this insight was borne out when you talk about like alpha versus beta dog research or wolf research, where when the people who did wolf studies realized that if you look at wolves in the wild, they don't replicate the social systems of wolves in captivity, and you don't have the whole soul one alpha thing, and that it was like a weird analogy to certain kind of primate observations that weren't even totally consistent in primates. The other example is like alpha chimps in chimp societies, except when all the beta chimps kill them and then they don't replace them, which does happen. It's not the dominant form of chimp organization, but it is a form of chimp organization that actually exists. And so when people throw this at me as if I'm using Althusserian humanities categories, people seem to forget that like my actual scholarly interest is English language literature. Yes, you can throw that at me, but also biological anthropology, explicitly biological anthropology. So like I actually am not one of the. I actually get really annoyed with David Graeber because he won't talk about genetics. I guess because of fears of sounding like some genetic race reductionist or something, and. I say this because I came to a lot of the same conclusions as trans theorists for completely different reasons, but for the same reasons you're talking about, looking at the social roles that different gender roles had in the past, and also realizing they involved the physical modification of bodies a lot of the time, and even when they didn't, they involved taking on secondary characteristics or removing secondary characteristics of genders so that you can appeal to be either genderless or male, depending. And in some rare cases, certain kinds of people identify who are male, who are I don't have good categories for this actually to try to respect everything, but who were viewed as being born male take on this third category that is feminized, but thus seen as totally outside of household or society. That also happened a lot. We talked about the shamans. Shamans often had androgynous characteristics. And I also thought about my time in just modern societies like South Korea and like feminine and like beauty ideas. We talk about the pressure of beauty ideas, and we always think about it being Western. But some of the categories that they would change to fit ideal body types are things that like we don't even think about, like epiglottal eyelids. Like whether or not you have the quote eyelid fold, and I remember walking into to a South Korean class with teaching 19-year-old women, and I could see the scar lines in 70% of the class, right? Like from having that surgery. Now, I don't associate that with femininity or beauty at all. It is an arbitrary characteristic, but it was something that like every woman I know who had the money to do in that culture did. not to look Western, which I've also heard, which is ridiculous. That like that beauty standard, apparently, even anthropologically, according to people who study Korean culture, goes back further than their contact with Europeans was documented. But it is part of this overall image of what it means to be female, and that also means doing things like in Korea, like literally carving out parts of the jawline. All right, because to have a more delicate jawline if you're a woman, and that's also super common. It's not as common as the epiglottal fold surgery, but these pressures are not the pressures we have. Like, you know what Korean women aren't doing is getting breast augmentation. All right, or what was seen as showing signifying female sexuality. So it was super common for women to wear very high skirts in Korea. No one thought anything about it. In fact, I quit thinking about it. But it was scandalous to show your shoulders. All right. Now, this seems like just arbitrary factoids. It's not related to our stuff here. But the sexualization and sexual reproduction and identifying of womanhood in all these cases involve either modifying or picking selective characteristics, of which seem kind of fucking arbitrary. Like, and similarly also with men, you know, for example, I'm going to go in here like very specific as a dude who doesn't talk, who like, I kind of reject the concept of sexuality for me personally. It's a whole different thing. I'm not going to go into it, but who is often identified as like a cis and assumed to be straight dude. I discovered that my ability to read what we consider gay characteristics in Korean men was non-existent. Like, it just, there was no tells that I could pick up on, even after living there for 2 years. They weren't our tells. All right. And I come with this American assumption that like your sexuality must be determined by something like biological. Like there must be some gay gene somewhere and some bi gene somewhere, because it doesn't seem like it's a choice, right? Clearly it's not a choice for most people. They don't actively think I'm going to be X. Like no one ever does that, including straight people, really. So the awareness that the secondary characteristics that we assume are identifying had to be cultural, but they were unconscious and not something that people were consciously adapting as like identity markers, started having me question a whole lot of these assumptions. I
think there's some really useful examples here. Like, hey, you finish your point. Because I was enjoying that. I was quite useful.
No. I think there's a lot of useful examples. I just think I'm using examples that aren't obvious to trans and non-trans, you know, trans and cis divisions. All right. On purpose to kind of reaffirm the point. When people say, for example, you know, the class is a material relationship, no one believes that your class is biological. Well, I'm not, actually, that's not true. But most people don't believe in a modern society that your class is biological. Right? You have to meet some pretty reactionary people who argue that poor people are poor because they are genetically inferior. Whatever that means.
Yeah. Had to be Charles Murray, basically.
Yeah.
On the question of like sexuality, right? Because I think this ties in quite well. It's like sexuality, we have accepted within contemporary ideology that something is either biological or it is a choice. That's like the binary that we're presented with. Because the notion of like social construction and stuff is like not taken on board within contemporary ideology. And I think this is real, and I think that like partly this is the fault of actually the liberal LGBT rights movement, who took on board the notion of born this way as like a sort of ideological plank of their demands. But like, I think that we can like have quite a serious discussion about like the way in which sexuality is socially constructed. I'm doing my postgrad research in psychoanalysis. I'm a Lacanian. So I don't deny the fact that there are like I don't deny the fact that like there are libidinal kind of drives that are product of our animal nature. But the ways in which these are understood and cognized and like even like acted upon are entirely the products of a variety of social and interpersonal relations. Like if you believe that there is a gay gene, just to anybody who believes that, I beg you to explain ancient Greece to me. Like what the fuck was going on?
Or medieval, or even like medieval Ottoman relations, or Rome, or et cetera, et cetera. You know, where like a certain class of
like.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's like it is clearly a social construct. It is clearly the product of obviously we have human desires and needs, but like it's clear that the way in which we identify our objects of sexual desire is like largely a social phenomenon.
One of the things that I thought was very
like
good.
This links to my like one of my key sort of, I guess it's kind of underneath my points in the article, but it's something that's worth talking about, is the notion that socialization doesn't always work. And I mean that in the sense that it's not always successful in producing the social outcomes that society wants. That there can be attempts to socialize people into certain sex and gender categories or sexuality categories, but it doesn't always work. And that we can start to see the basis for like, okay, well, we can see where queerness might start to come in here. And I have particular, I think that trans experience emerges from a breakdown in the mirror stage in like a Lacanian sort of framework of analysis. And that's basically what my postgrad work is on. But like that's a whole other fucking conversation. But I think that really like there is a but I think that like broadly speaking, we can see that socialization isn't always successful. I mean, it's obviously, once you say it like that, it's like, well, obviously, like the production process has defective goods,
right?
And I don't want to use the word defective in the sense of like bad. I think being queer is fantastic, but from a social perspective, from the perspective of like the maintenance of capitalist bourgeois society, it's clearly not what they want. We can see the bill in Texas as an example of that.
Right. I mean, I think we see this tons of this. There's so much here. The normalization of certain kinds of quote homosexualities unquote, and I'm using that because what I'm about to say will as identities. And then there was all this research in the late 90s, early aughts about sexual fluidity in biological women. Biological women here, I'm also using with a big star. And it led to the whole like, well, if people forget this, but this is 15 years ago, and I have a forever memory and hold grudges against people for decades. But I remember when Dan Savage was citing this early sexuality research from the 90s to say that there were no such thing as bisexual men or pansexual men, which blew my mind because I was like, well, how do you explain I don't know most of human society in the description of male relations? And also I've lived in cultures where they're clearly, and then they were like, well, women are more sexually fluid and for reasons of biology and evolutionary psychology, which should normally be a big red flag, women are more likely to be lesbians, and lesbians are more likely to be socially acceptable. And I was like, you've never studied East Asian culture if you say that. Like, now you can make the argument, for example, that it doesn't come up in Semitic cultures, because female sexuality is just not considered important at all. So they don't talk about lesbianism. It's not a taboo category. It's just not recognized as being a thing. Okay, fine. But in the case of certain East Asian cultures, lesbian acts are actually more taboo than male homosexual acts. And that completely blows up any evolutionary psychological gloss you have for what our current practices in the modern capitalist West about lesbianism being okay, blah 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 blah, and somehow that being biologically and thus material. There's no. If you actually know a lot about other cultures, that's not true, and conversely, this led to this denial that there was sexual fluidity in men, as as a category. Now, interestingly enough, the whole debates around the personhood or existence of trans people has thus led to all these debates. Actually, they weren't settled; they were just dropped. Although Dad Savage, I think, did about 10 years ago say he was wrong about the existence of bisexual men. They were a real thing. I was like, okay, really? That wasn't.
Dan Savage has the same views as my father. It's exactly the same. Dan Savage has exactly the same views as a 50-year-old Australian man who doesn't believe bisexuals are real. Yeah, it's cool. I was going to say, I think that this is really okay. Why is it that in say a country like Australia, this is true, and I'm sure this is also true in America and probably maybe in Britain as well, that it is broadly what are we actually talking about when we talk about lesbians being more socially acceptable? I don't think that's true at all in a practical sense. But what we are actually talking about is that homosociality is more common amongst women in these countries, in that women are more likely and more expected to maintain close friendships into adulthood with other women, and that this can take the form of physical affection and hugging and touching in a way that male homosociality doesn't in these cultures. That sort of skinship stuff. But also in Australia and America, at the very least, same-sex physicality and sexuality between women is socially acceptable if it is done for male entertainment / titillation. It's sort of it's seen as a fun and sexy thing to do, and it's seen as socially normal for heterosexual women to experiment, with that and not be seen as gay, because it's assumed that attraction to man is the default, and that men think it's hot, and so it's okay socially. Whereas actual lesbian relationships, first things first, you're going to get objectified a lot by dudes who are going to be oh, can I watch blah blah blah, whatever. But also lesbian relationships are not socially acceptable in the way in the same way that male homosexual relationships are not seen as socially acceptable. That has changed a lot in the last 10 years, or last 15, 20 years even. But there are still plenty of places in these countries where they are heavily taboo. And you could be met with violence for being out, etc. And I do think that the thing about the debates, you're absolutely right. These debates have been going on for decades, and they had just been dropped. People just stopped talking about them. They got busy, and the recent discussions about trans identity have brought them all back into the public light. And now we're all arguing about this all the time, which is pretty interesting. But I think now is the time to start putting some of this shit to bed, and settling this stuff, because there is we've got some of these ideas are just straight up backwards and ridiculous. They need to be expunged, especially from the left. The fact that there's so much of this can pass in left-wing circles is frankly embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's not just embarrassing. It indicates that like they haven't thought about the relationship. They're not even thinking about the relationship with the category. Like they don't understand the categories they're using. So, for example, this whole ideological means idea, material means I don't know, because they don't seem to define it very much. It seems to be sometimes biological and sometimes social, but not social when it's inconvenient, like when we're talking about gender, but it is social when we're talking about class. And race, meh, and I'm like, if you want to say there are biological correlates, frankly, I just spent a whole, 45 minutes basically implying strongly biological race is horse crap, but there are biological correlates to, I don't know, melanin levels and yeah, there's biological correlates to a lot of things, right? There's even biological correlates to genetic drift. So what I mean here, like there are certain regions of the world where, because of captive populations, you do have a predominance of certain traits. Those don't really align to race, and yet no one, like most leftists, don't have a problem admitting, okay, well, if we realize that there might be some biological correlates that tie to these things that we associate with race, but we also realize that race doesn't really associate to phenotype or genotype. If we even think about that, sometimes we don't even deal with that at all. Sometimes we just say the whole concept is racist, so we're not going to deal with it. Fine. But then you throw this with gender and you see the same arguments come back. It's fascinating to me why that is the case. It's and I say this as a person who I do think the way that everybody, and I would say everybody here also includes the popular discourse in the Western world about trans people, and sometimes from trans people themselves, is not helpful. Like here, and I used to think things like distinguishing gender from sex was helpful, but then I was like, no. When I really think about it, the amount of social modification we do to maintain like sex role stereotypes, and some of which are quite physical, also loses me. Now, every now and then people will kind of half realize this, like they'll talk about the Texas law and point out that according to the Texas law, the way it's written, that say, for example, circumcision would actually count as child abuse, but they haven't thought about that, and of course they're not going to enforce it. But then they haven't thought about what that actually says. Like the larger point of that, like how much biological modification is going into any expression of any gender anywhere. And including stuff like, I do, like I keep a beard. It's masculine identifying, but I also shave it in certain way. I mean, like and these things seem, oh, well, that's superficial. That doesn't matter. Well, a lot of these things are superficial.
Yeah, well, I mean, the beard thing is really interesting, right? Because this is deep Roxy lore, right? I used to have a beard before I transitioned. Horrible, really terrible stuff. But like this, from my experience of having a beard, right? You're absolutely right, but it's a masculine identifier, and it's like doesn't even correlate specifically to sort of attractive. If you say in a heterosexual, it doesn't necessarily correlate to attractiveness with women. Like I think that people are like, oh yeah, well I do it to look more masculine. That means women will like women overwhelmingly, if you have a beard, I'm sure that you can probably testify to this. The overwhelming compliments come from men who are like, I like your beard, it's cool. It's like dudes like other dudes' beards. They think it looks cool. Like, oh yeah, we're masculine. Look at us, we're great. It's like women are like, meh. Like some women really like it, but a lot of women don't. I don't really like facial hair on men. Like a lot of women don't. It's like it's a social marker of masculinity, but the idea that it has these things are complex. I think it's really I think it's a really 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 interesting phenomena. I think I think that a lot of there's a lot of weak theorizing on the left, I mean, and in general about gender. and I include the trans left in this, like the weak theorizing goes all the way down. Like there's a lot of like very like, and this is why I think like my article was really like why I felt the need to write it is because like, well, we need to put ourselves on a solid foundation. We need to actually stand ourselves up and be like, what are we talking about here? I was gonna say on the oh no, it slipped my mind. Never mind. But yeah, we need to put ourselves on a solid theoretical foundation to have these conversations. Because if we aren't, then we're going to just go around in circles and talk about like like everything's going to be confused, and it's going to lead us into all sorts of weird and reactionary directions. And having a theory of gender is important for a whole bunch of reasons, not just to talk about trans issues, but to talk about the way in which ideology is formed in the contemporary world, because it's highly gendered. I mean, I don't think that you can understand contemporary fascism without understanding the crisis of masculinity caused by the decline of the post-war consensus, and what that meant for a certain generation of men. You can identify them with like the incel social category. Like you need to have a solid understanding of gender and what that means in order to understand where this is coming from. But the last thing I know to everyone listening to this and to the chat and everybody, if you want something to like read to get a better handle on like what's actually going on when it comes to biology and gender, a good like popular sort of level introduction, if you're like me and don't really know that much about biology, is Cordelia Fine's Delusions of Gender. She like it's just a really great like introductory level sort of discussion, and she does really useful stuff where she actually, rather than just being like, oh, trans experiences, either chucking them out or like using it as like being like, oh, trans people aren't really what they say they are or whatever. She actually uses trans experiences as like a useful like indicator mark. So for example, she talks a lot about like trans men who like enter the work, who like over the course of their transitions experience like systematic increases in like how they're treated at work. Like, and how like people will like respond to their emails and treat them better after their transition than they did before, and like how this is like measurable. And there's a bunch of like really interesting things there. But it's just a book recommendation.
So I think we'll wrap this up here. I put a link to the initial article that spawned this discussion in the chat. I would also tell people, I'd recommend that Delusions of Gender book. There's a couple of books that really this. I'd also tell people to read some good text on
Inferior.
Right.
Yeah. I've got a couple of them on my bookshelf next to me, yeah.
I also would tell people to look at this, like the historical and social construction of a whole lot of our identitarian types. Not in the sense, like when we say stuff is socially constructed, I think people should understand we're not saying it's not real, and we're not saying there's no relationship to biology, and actually in any of these things. But we are saying that it's not as simple, and the even like the idea, for example, like that sex is determined by X, Y, XX, XY, X chromosomes starts to break down when you realize how many people who have different sex chromosomes than when I say how many people, it's not like 1 in a million, it's like 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 100 in some cases, where you have divergence in genital manifestation, and from say XX and XYY. Or XXY. I think XYY is not viable, but these are way more common. And I don't just mean in manifesting in intersex people. There's all these things that happen, and they're not. And they also happen to people in ways that aren't socially identifiable to anyone, and the people who they happen to may not have ever known. So,
well, like, I mean, there are more. Statistically speaking, there's almost certainly more intersex people than there are redheads. And if one was to do a categorization of human hair color, they would probably say that if you didn't include redheads, you'd be being statistically, like, you'd be doing a bad job. So, like, it seems that, like, I just had a couple of other book recommendations I had was Inferior by Angela Saini is a really good book, as is everything by Ray Connell is great, but Gender in World Perspectives is the one I've got, which is my kind of introductory textbook to gender, and it has an entire chapter on sex differences in gendered bodies, and a bunch of things about that, and examples of gender research and stuff like that. It's just like really, really, really good. Ray Connell's great. She also wrote a book on masculinity, like it's called like Masculinities, which is like, if you want to like just like theorizing men and masculinity is just as important as theorizing women and femininity, and it's an area that I think needs a lot more work. So I recommend people read that too.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and with that, I'm going to hop off and talk to you later. Thank you for coming on, Roxy. This is a different kind of conversation, one that I wish to have more on. And one that I wish people would look at. I would say that yes, we need to have our Marxist levels on or whatever, but I would actually think we need to look at this more seriously anthropologically and dig into the historical examples and the scholarship, and then try to reconcile the seeming incoherence and contradictions that come up in all this scholarship, because there's a ton. And what I find is those contradictions led me to a similar position to you, probably for vastly different reasons, but because, you know, whatever you think of my gender, sexuality, or whatever, I look like a normal dude bro, and sometimes I've joked that my gender identity is dude bro, and there's class elements to that too. There's all kinds of complicated elements to that, but it's interesting because it's led to assumptions about, for example, my sexuality, my views on care work, my views on household labor, etc. And when I looked at this stuff anthropologically, I was like, well, no, none of this really holds up. There's a lot of more complicated stuff going on here. And I've felt, frankly, that when a lot of this gender stuff, even see, I can't help but say it with somewhat frustration, started coming up about 15 years ago in the popular culture. I mean, this has been happening for a while in queer and academic culture, kind of separately and simultaneously and overlappingly. But I thought, oh, maybe we can open up some of these discussions about this stuff historically. And what I've actually seen happen is the opposite. I've seen people double down on things they would have never doubled down on in the 90s, and stuff like that. And it's been very frustrating to me. And so that's what I would like to do. And I don't want to frame this solely as a, framing this as like woke versus TERFs or anything. I just hate all that framing. It's not particularly useful.
No, it's stupid. I find a lot of that stuff quite pointless. The question for me is like, how do we understand what's going on in our lives and theorize it thoroughly so that we can transform it and make our lives better and live freer, more equal lives? That's really what the core of my article is about, and how that relates to the struggle for communism, which I think is kind of integral to this.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I had a really good time.
Thank you for coming on.
I'm quite I've never done this before, so this is like quite scary, but I had a good time. So anytime. This was awesome. Yeah.
I think a lot of people appreciated it, and this will come out in a couple of weeks in a podcast too.
Aww.
Have a great day.
Oh, awesome. Well, I can't actually see the chats, but thank you, everybody who's nice to me. And for those of you who aren't nice to me, you will never know the touch of a woman. Goodbye.